It is a cold morning on the Anatolian frontier, sometime in the middle of the 13th century, and a small band of Turkish horsemen sits motionless on a ridge above a river valley. Below them, a Byzantine watchtower stands at the edge of a fortified village, its garrison unaware that anyone is watching. Behind these horsemen, further east, a shadow far larger than any Byzantine garrison has already swallowed empires. Baghdad has fallen. The Seljuk Sultanate that these horsemen technically serve has been humbled on the battlefield and forced into submission. And the man leading this small band, a frontier chieftain named Ertugrul, understands something that will define the next 100 years of history. He is caught between two collapsing worlds, a Byzantine frontier crumbling in front of him and a Mongol shadow closing in from behind. He has almost nothing. A few hundred tents, a herd of animals, and a strip of contested land that nobody wants to defend. What he chooses to do next will eventually give birth to an empire that outlives every power pressing down on him that morning.
What most people never learn is that the empire built from this moment did not begin with a grand army or a royal bloodline. It began with a small, displaced tribe, squeezed between two forces capable of erasing it entirely, and a leader who understood that survival itself could be a form of strategy. This is the story of Ertugrul Ghazi, the Kayi Tribe, and the age of Mongol terror and Byzantine decline that shaped the ground the Ottoman Empire would eventually rise from.
Before going further, it is worth being honest about something. Ertugrul is one of history's most thinly documented figures. No contemporary chronicle from his own lifetime survives describing his daily campaigns in detail. Almost everything historians know about him comes from Ottoman chronicles written more than a century after his death, composed specifically to legitimize the dynasty his son Osman would found. Later legend, and in recent years popular television drama, have filled in the gaps with dramatic battles and named rivalries that cannot be confirmed in the historical record. What can be confirmed is the world Ertugrul lived in. A world genuinely being torn apart by Mongol conquest on one side and Byzantine collapse on the other. And that is the story worth telling honestly.
The Kayi were one of the 24 tribes of the Oghuz Turks, a nomadic confederation that had been drifting westward out of Central Asia for generations, pushed by drought, by rival tribes, and eventually by the most destructive military force the medieval world had ever seen. Ertugrul's father, Suleiman Shah, according to tradition, led the Kayi tribe further and further west across Persia and into Anatolia, fleeing the advancing Mongol armies of Genghis Khan and his successors. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, but the machine he built did not stop. His descendants kept expanding, and by the 1230s and 1240s, Mongol columns were pushing deep into the Middle East and Asia Minor, destroying cities that resisted and absorbing those that submitted.
The Kayi were refugees before they were conquerors. That detail matters because it explains almost everything that follows. Ertugrul did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a wandering camp of tents, livestock, and a few thousand people looking for somewhere to survive. Tradition holds that the tribe split at some point, with part of it turning back towards Central Asia, and the rest, under Ertugrul, continuing into Anatolia, where the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum still controlled much of the interior.
The Seljuks of Rum were themselves a fading power. For over a century, they had ruled central Anatolia from their capital at Konya, presiding over a rich, cosmopolitan realm sitting on the Byzantine frontier. But by the time Ertugrul and the Kayi arrived seeking land, the Sultanate was already weakening internally, strained by succession disputes and by a threat it could not ignore: Mongol expansion pressing from the east. According to Ottoman tradition, Ertugrul first proved himself to the Seljuks, not through diplomacy, but through timely intervention on a battlefield. The most repeated version of the story says he came across a Seljuk army, led by Sultan Ala al-Din Kayqubad, locked in a losing battle against a Byzantine force, and threw his own small band of horsemen into the fight, turning the tide. Historians flag real chronology problems with this story, since the timeline of Kayqubad's reign and Ertugrul's known lifespan do not comfortably line up, and no independent source confirms the battle at all. But the underlying pattern it describes, A landless frontier chieftain earning territory through military usefulness to the Seljuk state fits the broader reality of how these frontier lordships across Anatolia were actually formed. In gratitude, tradition says, the Sultan granted Ertugrul territory around the town of Soğut, near the Byzantine border in northwestern Anatolia, along with the neighboring pastures of Domanich for summer grazing. It was a small grant. It was also, in hindsight, one of the most consequential land grants in world history.
Soğut sat on what medieval Turks called the Uç, the frontier march, a rugged, contested borderland between Seljuk territory and the shrinking edge of the Byzantine Empire. It was not a peaceful place. It was a strip of contested land where Turkish Ghazis, frontier warriors fighting in the name of Islam and territorial expansion, clashed constantly with Byzantine border garrisons, local Greek lords, and rival Turkish beyliks, all competing for the same shrinking pool of farmland and fortresses. For a small tribe like the Kayi, this was both an opportunity and a death sentence. Land on the frontier was land nobody else wanted defended, which meant it was land available to whoever was tough enough to hold it. Ertugrul spent the following decades doing exactly that, launching raids against Byzantine outposts, absorbing smaller Turkish groups into his following, and slowly expanding Kayi territory, fortress by fortress, village by village.
The Byzantine Empire the Kayi were pushing against was itself a shadow of what it had once been. A generation earlier, in 1204, Crusader armies had sacked Constantinople itself, splintering the empire into rival successor states, and leaving the restored Byzantine government in Nicaea, and later back in Constantinople after 1261, permanently weakened. Border defense in Anatolia depended increasingly on local Greek magnates called akriti, semi-independent frontier lords holding fortified towns with whatever garrison they could scrape together, since the imperial treasury in Constantinople had little left to spare for the eastern frontier. That made the border near Soğut a strange kind of contest, not a clash between two organized armies, but a grinding, decades-long exchange of raids, sieges, and shifting local loyalties between Turkish Ghazis and Greek frontier lords who were often just as isolated and under-resourced as Ertugrul's own tribe. Villages changed hands more than once. Some Greek communities converted or intermarried with the incoming Turks rather than fight a war they could not win. Others held fortified hilltops for years against repeated Kayi raids. This was the actual texture of the war the Kayi tribe fought, less a single dramatic campaign and more a relentless, generational pressure that slowly reshaped who controlled the land between the Sultanate and the sea.
Ertugrul and his Kayi warriors continue fighting small border wars against Byzantine frontier garrisons. The focus shifts eastward, where a much greater catastrophe is unfolding. The year 1243 is introduced. Kosedah in northeastern Anatolia is introduced. General Baiju leads the Mongol army toward the Seljuk forces. The Seljuk field army prepares for battle. The Battle of Kosedah begins. Mongol cavalry overwhelms the Seljuk army. The battle becomes completely one-sided. Seljuk soldiers retreat in chaos. The Seljuk Sultan flees the battlefield. The remaining Seljuk army scatters. The Mongols secure complete victory. The once powerful Seljuk Sultanate begins to collapse. The Seljuk Sultanate becomes a Mongol vassal. Mongol officials supervise Seljuk internal affairs. The defeat destroys the authority that once granted Ertugrul his land. Frontier rulers realize the balance of power has changed forever. Ertugrul understands that survival now requires a different strategy.
The political authority that originally granted Ertugrul his land is shown collapsing. The consequences of the defeat spread across the Anatolian frontier. Frontier lords like Ertugrul realize that everything has changed. The Battle of Kosedah forces every frontier ruler to rethink their survival strategy. The Seljuk Sultans continue occupying the throne after 1243. The narration explains that these sultans now rule only in name. A Seljuk Sultan sits on the throne while Mongol overseers hold the real authority. The Seljuk court functions under constant Mongol supervision. The Mongol Empire's Western commanders direct Seljuk affairs from behind the scenes. The timeline advances to 1256.
The newly established Ilkhanate is introduced. The Ilkhanate is shown emerging as the Mongol state governing Persia and the Middle East. Hulagu Khan is introduced as the founder of the Ilkhanate. The narration identifies Hulagu as the grandson of Genghis Khan. Hulagu's expanding campaign spread across the Middle East. The enormous scale of Hulagu's conquests is emphasized. The timeline advances to 1258. Hulagu's armies approach the city of Baghdad. The Mongol siege of Baghdad begins. Baghdad's defenses collapse before the Mongol assault.
Mongol forces storm into the city. The Abbasid Caliphate comes to an end after 5 centuries of rule. Large numbers of civilians are killed during the sack of Baghdad. The city suffers widespread destruction. Buildings are reduced to ruins and ash. Baghdad's role as the intellectual center of the Islamic world comes to an end. The devastation of Baghdad shocks the Muslim world. Messengers carry news of the catastrophe across neighboring lands. The news reaches rulers throughout the Islamic world. Leaders from Konya to Soghit react with fear to the reports.
The destruction of Baghdad reshapes how neighboring rulers think about survival. The lesson becomes unmistakable across the region. Submission to the Mongols is understood as a way to buy time. Resistance is understood to bring total destruction. The narration clarifies that no historical record exists of Ertugrul personally fighting Hulagu Khan. The absence of any direct battle between Ertugrul and Hulagu is emphasized. The story rejects later legends that invent such a confrontation. Hulagu's campaigns are shown centered in Persia. The Mongol armies continue their campaigns through Iraq. Hulagu's forces expand into the Levant. The Byzantine frontier, where Ertugrul lived, is shown far from Hulagu's main campaigns. The narration explains that although the two men never met, their histories became connected. The Seljuk state serving Ertugrul gradually falls under the Mongol system. The Seljuks become tributaries of the Mongol Empire, ruled by Hulagu. Ertugrul continues leading raids against Byzantine frontier territory. The looming presence of Mongol authority hangs over every frontier campaign. A visual contrast shows Ertugrul fighting nearby enemies, while the distant Mongol Empire dominates the region. The narration explains that Mongol power could reach the frontier if the Kayi Tribe crossed the line. The Kayi Tribe carefully avoids provoking Mongol intervention. The conflict is revealed as a long struggle of positioning rather than one decisive battle.
The Kayi warriors continue fighting visible Byzantine enemies. The invisible pressure of Mongol dominance remains in the background. Ertugrul balances expansion with caution. The narration emphasizes that survival depends on calculated restraint. The story transitions to the year 1265. Hulagu Khan dies while ruling the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate remains intact after Hulagu's death. Hulagu's successors inherit control of the Ilkhanate. The new Ilkhan rulers continue exercising authority over the Seljuk Sultanate. The Seljuk Sultans of Konya remain under Mongol domination. Mongol garrisons are stationed throughout Seljuk territory. Mongol tax officials collect tribute from the population. Mongol administrators supervise regional affairs. Rival Seljuk princes compete for the throne. Mongol-backed factions interfere in Seljuk succession disputes. The timeline advances into the 1270s. The Seljuk Sultanate is shown as little more than an administrative shell. Real authority is exercised by Mongol governors instead of the Seljuk court. The Ilkhanate's regional overseers control central Anatolia. Some Anatolian Turkish lords openly resent Mongol domination. Opposition to Mongol rule begins to organize. The Karamanid dynasty emerges as the leader of a major uprising. Its allies join the rebellion against Mongol control. The rebellion spreads across parts of Anatolia. Mongol forces respond with overwhelming military power. The uprising is brutally crushed. The destruction mirrors the harsh methods used at Baghdad. The rebellion ends in complete defeat. The lesson spreads throughout Anatolia once again. Direct resistance against the Ilkhanate is shown leading only to destruction. The narration shifts focus back to Ertugrul. Ertugrul's greatest strength is presented as survival, rather than legendary conquest. He understands the limits of his tribe's power. He carefully measures how much risk the Kayi tribe can survive. Ertugrul continues attacking Byzantine frontier positions. The Kayi tribe captures territory little by little. Raids gradually expand Kayi influence. Fortresses are taken one after another.
Each successful campaign strengthens the tribe. Ertugrul deliberately avoids attracting Mongol attention. He refuses to challenge the Ilkhanate directly. The narration explains that no Anatolian frontier lord could survive such a war. Other larger Anatolian powers openly resist Mongol authority. Those resisting states are crushed by the Mongols. Their defeat serves as another warning to all frontier rulers. The Kayi tribe survives because it never becomes a major threat to the Mongol Empire. The narration concludes that Ertugrul's restraint is what allows his people to endure. The Kayi tribe continues growing quietly while avoiding destruction. Their survival becomes the foundation for future expansion. The sequence ends with Ertugrul maintaining the delicate balance between fighting the Byzantines and avoiding conflict with the Mongols.
The narration moves into the later decades of Ertugrul's life. The once landless Kayi tribe is now established as a small frontier principality. The principality is centered around the town of Sogod. Permanent fortifications now protect the Kayi settlement. The frontier town grows steadily under Ertugrul's leadership. More Turkish settlers arrive and join the Kayi domain. Local converts become part of the growing community. The Kayi population continues expanding. Neighboring Byzantine lords recognize Ertugrul as a persistent frontier raider. The Kayi tribe earns a reputation as a dangerous force along the frontier. The narration compares the Kayi tribe to the surrounding great powers. The tiny Kayi principality is contrasted with the enormous Ilkhanate. The Mongol Empire's destruction of Baghdad is recalled to emphasize its strength. The weakened Byzantine Empire is still vastly larger than the Kayi. The narration emphasizes that the Kayi remain small. Their survival is presented as more important than their size. The Kayi continue absorbing nearby villages. Another Byzantine frontier outpost falls under Kayi control. Each captured settlement increases the tribe's population. Every new village expands Kayi territory.
Each victory strengthens Ertugrul's legitimacy as a frontier ruler. The narration reminds the audience that the Kayi had originally arrived in Anatolia with nothing. The transformation from refugees to frontier rulers is highlighted. The timeline advances to around 1281. An elderly Ertugrul spends his final years in Soet, the border town where he first received land is shown once again. Ertugrul dies in Soet. The narration notes that he lived to an old age for his era. The small frontier principality mourns its leader. The narration states that Ertugrul never ruled an empire. It is emphasized that he never fought Hulagu Khan in open battle. The story rejects any claim suggesting such a confrontation occurred. Attention shifts from legendary myths to Ertugrul's real legacy. The hardened Kayi frontier tribe stands ready for the future. Experienced warriors gather after years of constant frontier warfare. The tribe is shown as disciplined and battle-tested. Their experience living between rival empires is emphasized. A young Osman is introduced among the Kayi. Osman watches and learns from his father's leadership.
He grows up observing how Ertugrul balances survival between powerful enemies. The narration shifts from Ertugrul to Osman. Osman inherits the Kayi frontier domain. The responsibility of leading the tribe passes to Osman. Osman begins expanding Kayi territory more aggressively than his father. The pace of conquest increases under Osman's leadership. The weakened Byzantine frontier becomes Osman's target. The Mongol-controlled Seljuk state is shown continuing to decline. Osman exploits the weakness of both neighboring powers. Rival Turkish beyliks begin falling under Osman's control. The Kayi domain continues expanding. Osman gradually unites more frontier territories. His growing strength allows him to pursue independence. Osman declares an independence that Ertugrul's generation could never safely attempt. A new state is officially established. The narration explains that the state takes its name from Osman. The name Ottomans is introduced. The humble origins of the Ottoman state are recalled. The early Kayi refugees are shown arriving in Anatolia with only a few thousand people. The tribe is surrounded by the crumbling Byzantine frontier. The shadow of the Mongol world looms over Anatolia. The passage of time is shown as the Ottoman state steadily expands. Generations of Ottoman growth transformed the small frontier principality into a major empire. The Ottoman armies approach Constantinople centuries later. Constantinople is conquered by the Ottomans. The empire expands across 3 continents. The narration concludes by emphasizing that the tiny refugee tribe ultimately ruled for 600 years. The story transitions from the medieval era to the present day. The modern town of Souit is introduced. Souit is shown as a small town in modern Turkey. Despite its size, the town proudly preserves its historical heritage. The narration introduces Ertugrul's mausoleum. The mausoleum is presented as the traditional resting place of Ertugrul. The tomb is shown having been restored and expanded during the Ottoman era. Ottoman sultans are shown honoring Ertugrul as their founding ancestor. The dynasty traces its legitimacy back to Ertugrul and the early Kayi tribe. The humble beginnings of the Kayi tents are recalled. The narration shifts to Souit's annual traditions. The town prepares for its yearly September commemoration. People gather to honor Ertugrul's memory. The ceremony celebrates him as the founding ancestor of the Ottoman dynasty.
The story reflects on the great powers that once surrounded Ertugrul. The Ilkhanate is shown beginning to fragment after Hulagu's death. The Mongol state gradually breaks apart. The Ilkhanate disappears from history. Attention shifts to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine frontier near Souit is recalled. The timeline advances to 1453. Ottoman armies march toward Constantinople. One of Osman's descendants leads the campaign. Constantinople falls to the Ottomans. The Byzantine Empire comes to an end. The narration compares the fate of Ertugrul's former rivals. Both the Ilkhanate and the Byzantine Empire have vanished. The Kayi tribe is shown surviving both great powers. The tribe that once seemed insignificant ultimately outlasts its mighty rivals. The narration transitions from history to its deeper meaning. The audience is reminded that Ertugrul's story is not defined by legendary battles. Later storytellers are shown embellishing historical events. The contrast between legend and documented history is emphasized. The narration returns to the authentic historical lesson. The real achievement is presented as patience and survival. The story emphasizes disciplined decision-making over heroic myths. The narration explains that not every battle is worth fighting. Ertugrul is shown choosing only the conflicts he could realistically win. The looming power of larger empires remains in the background. The Kayi tribe survives by avoiding unwinnable wars. The years pass while stronger rivals disappear. The transformation from near extinction to empire is summarized. The final lesson is presented. Survival can become the foundation of greatness. The narration concludes that patience can outlast overwhelming power. The documentary transitions toward its closing message. The audience is invited to subscribe to the channel. Viewers are encouraged to leave a comment suggesting another frontier empire or founding figure. The audience is asked to like the video if they learn something new. The documentary ends with the legacy of Ertugrul and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as the final lasting image.